The good news is I just got a new job. Yay! The bad news is it's not going to get in the way of working on this video series, so we can all keep slowly circling further into hell together. Yay! Hello, friends and viewing public. Welcome to Storytime, a channel for talking about stories and learning and having fun and stuff. You're watching another installment of MCU Retro Dome, my sad, troubling, oddly endearing cry for help masquerading as a critical appraisal of Marvel's Infinity Saga.
Please don't call yourself fat.
After taking a detour into some pretty dark territory with Guardians of the Galaxy #2, we're getting back into just the regular kind of dumbs we've come to expect from these movies with Spider-Man Homecoming, the film that proves definitively that Marvel really doesn't like its audience. Today we're going to talk about the ways Marvel expresses that dislike through this movie, which include constantly breaking the story through bad writing, making the protagonist the worst kid ever, and constantly breaking the story through bad writing. In addition to offering some pretty heavy criticism of the story's terrible, horrible, no good, very bad storytelling, we'll also be spoiling the film's very important and interesting plot. If you're not here for that,
get out.
No, I'm serious.
No, I mean get out of my office.
Spider-Man Homecoming is a 2017 film directed by John Watts. It is the reboot of the Amazing Spider-Man Almost trilogy, which was the reboot of the regular Spider-Man Actual trilogy, which was the reboot of the Amazing Spider-Man on TV, none of which have anything to do with the Spider-Verse Spider-Man from the year after this movie. Prior to his work on Spider-Man Homeward Bound, John Watts directed comedy stuff, including a bunch of short films. He also worked on the short-lived Onion News Network and made his feature debut with the feel-good comedy Clown. You can see why Marvel would want him to direct the long-awaited return of their most beloved character. What? I don't know, maybe he sent in the most box tops or something. Film was written by all of these guys.
I am not a committee!
A relay team of various partnerships of primarily TV writers whose credits include American Dad, Community, and a million spec scripts for various sitcoms. Committee members' film credits include The Lego Movie, Horrible Bosses, and indisputable classics like Vacation and The Incredible Burt Wonderstone. Definitely what you might call a mixed bag, but hey, who are we to judge? Marvel can crush the spirits of visionary filmmakers and dull their work into flavorless mush. Who's to say they can't also turn the work of a loose conglomerate of unrelated comedy writers into a coherent, dramatic story that doesn't treat its audience with disgust?
No. No, let me think.
Huh? Oh, yeah, it's me. I say they can't do that. Why do you ask?
You will see. Hurry. You will see.
First, more important than who created this movie, is how it was created. See, once upon a time, Marvel's characters were so popular among fans that it was forced to declare bankruptcy and auction off the film rights to those characters in order to stay solvent. Not just the loser characters, even the special ones.
Don't you know who I am?
Spider-Man, arguably their most specialist and belovedest piece of IP, made his lonely way over to Sony, who used him to headline a trilogy of movies that helped make superheroes a viable 21st century blockbuster entity and usher in the modern cinematic hellscape we now enjoy. To be fair, Fox's X-Men first trilogy also shares this blame, their attempts at Fantastic Four less so. But after Spider-Man 3 was a little disappointing, apparently, Sony hit the brakes, retooled Spidey, and brought him back 5 years later to headline his own cinematic universe. This one also didn't meet expectations, but we got Morbius out of it, and so it was scrapped. Then Disney, like the exasperated adult tired of watching a kid try and tie their shoes, took charge again, strong-arming Sony into loaning them Spider-Man as MCU was metastasizing into its final terminal stage. Or so we thought. As you remember, he first showed up in a very narratively necessary sequence in Captain America Civil War, but his true debut would be reserved for Spider-Man Homecoming, which would celebrate the triumphant return of Marvel's long-lost prodigal son. You know, the prodigal son whose father sold him off to avoid going broke and only wanted him back to further his own commercial prospects. But Spidey's home and he's never getting away again.
You'll be my friend. I'm never gonna let you get away.
Anyway, the movie's story chronicles the adventures of young Peter Parker after he gets home from committing violent, destructive crimes in Germany. He wants to prove himself to Tony Stark so he can become a full-time child Avenger, which he wants for some reason. Then he accidentally uncovers an unrelated plot involving the sale of weapons he deems to be illegal, by the father of his new girlfriend no less, right in the middle of homecoming week. What will he do? These are the movie's characters. Peter Parker. Peter is a freshman at a science high school in New York City, where he lives with a woman named May he is presumably related to. He apparently has spider powers of some kind which allow him to do things, we assume. As you can tell, we know pretty much nothing about him other than that he has no impulse control and a massive savior complex, which is a problem we'll dive into with relish soon enough. Birdman. Birdman is a blue-collar salvage worker guy who decides to become a trafficker of alien technology after the Ataris attack New York and he gets pushed out of business by the definitely real before now Department of Damage Control. He operates mechanical jet wings only for evil instead of good. All he wants is to be a super wealthy working class hero for his daughter and to murder the inept child vigilante who is slightly threatening his biggest sale yet.
Ah! I'm gonna kill that kid!
Tony Stark. Tony appears intermittently as Peter's mentor, which here means essentially ignoring him until he does something that nearly kills hundreds of people. He also asks Pepper to marry him as a distraction in a press conference. Yay, true love! Glad they're not taking a break anymore and that we got to see them resolve their lingering conflicts about Tony's vigilantism in scenes on screen, just like in a real movie, instead of pretending that whole storyline didn't happen. With regards to Peter, I think Tony just wants to resolve some of his daddy issues by having a proxy son, but I'm meeting the movie more than halfway on that. Ned's sidekick. Ned is Peter's friend at the science school. He wants to be a guy-in-the-chair sidekick, and he is, using tracking software he just has, I guess. He's also the 6th black or brown sidekick to a white hero, because Marvel values all people equally. Someday. May. May is, we assume, Peter's legal guardian. The movie calls her his aunt, although whether she is actually the sister of one of his parents or it's just an affectionate moniker the movie never clarifies, as we'll get to. However she is or isn't related to Peter, she is definitely a meaningful, impactful character who has clear desires of her own and isn't just there so Peter can have a mom figure to not talk to and for everyone else to think is hot, because Marvel loves women. There is also an MJ character the movie doesn't really care about, but which we know from other movies will be important, a rich bully who picks on Peter for reasons which are definitely real and help us understand Peter more as a character, and of course the girl whose father is the bad guy, who Peter loves so much we definitely learn her name. It's like Christine or Liz or something. Marvel loves women. But whatever, so far so Marvel. We've got an assemblage of more or less average for Marvel characters working through a predictably maudlin plot that, shocker, doesn't actually make any sense once you look at it. Nothing we haven't covered before once or twice. Okay, maybe a lot. Okay, a lot. So Marvel has trouble telling functioning stories. What's the big deal? Well, the problem is that Spider-Man Homecoming has basically none of the elements of a functioning story, and not even just because of laziness. It's because Marvel kinda hates you. Remember what we always say about stories on this channel? In order to have a story, you need 5 things. People and places doing things, encountering resistance, and working to overcome that resistance. If you're missing one or more of those elements, you don't have a story. It might be interesting, or funny, or pretty, but it isn't a narrative. Which, of course, is fine if you aren't trying to tell a story. A little more of a problem if you are. Many other MCU movies have had issues in the story department, most often when it comes to conflict. So how does Spider-Man measure up? Well, let's just say it's a couple of pepperonis short, and by a couple I mean all the pepperonis, and the cheese, and also the crust. But there's some sauce.
Well, that's good news.
Basically, the only thing the movie has to work with is a setting. We know it takes place in New York, and the various locations in the movie are clearly shown, and even impact what happens, which is good. It's just missing everything else, including a coherent conflict, a plot related to what characters actually want, and even a main character, which is a particularly amazing feat considering the name of the protagonist is, the title of the movie. What are you talking about, you say? Of course there are characters. People are clearly in the movie doing things and stuff, and this is true. Some of them even have names and get to talk words. What's technically missing is characterization, the things we know about each character that make them distinct, and which contribute to the building of plot, conflict, and ultimately narrative. On that count, we have virtually nothing, especially about our titular character. Ask yourself, what do we know about Peter Parker beyond basic trivia? Things like his motivations, attitudes, and backstory. Easy, you say. We know he got bit by a magic spider, which gave him magic spider powers like webs, strength, and heightened sensory input he uses to swing around and fight crime. We also know he was adopted by his Aunt May and has been raised by her in the face of a shady, tragic backdrop. Except, this movie tells us none of that. This movie, as we have it, does nothing to characterize Peter apart from showing his terrible personality, which doesn't really count as characterization since the movie seems to be unaware of it, which we'll get to. Instead, it just kind of says to the audience, yeah, you guys know the story, you've seen it twice now, just go with it here because we're not really going to be doing anything different. Not only is this lazy on the part of the storytellers, it shows their outright contempt for the audience. You're not even worth the most cursory amount of character exposition or the faintest attempt at newness or originality.
You get nothing! You lose!
Let me lay this out plainly. These are the things we know about Peter that the movie actually tells us. His name, age, and gender, where he lives, what he wants, to be an Avenger, that he has crush on girl.
Are those the only choices?
These are things we don't know about Peter, but that the movie assumes we'll fill in for ourselves based on our preferred recent Spider-Man mythology. The source of his powers, including under what circumstances he received them and how much he had to do with it. What exactly his powers are. For example, what, if anything, his spidey senses are, how and for how long he can cling to things, whether he has abnormal strength or agility, how his synthetic webbing works, including how it is stored and released, and why he decided he needed to make synthetic webbing at all, how those powers have developed. Like, did they all show up at once fully formed, or is there the possibility that they are still developing? How his powers manifest in him mentally and physically, like how he experiences them, whether they ebb and flow, and whether they interfere with his normal senses. Why he is nervous about revealing his powers to May, with whom he otherwise has a pretty open relationship. Why he lives with May in the first place. What happened to his family? Did he ever have one? Has he ever lived with other family members? How he feels about whoever his family was before whatever happened to them, if anything happened to them. How long he has lived with May? Like, is this pretty recent or all he knows? How he is related to May, if at all. Is she the sister of his mother or father? A distant cousin? A family friend? Just some nice lady who lived in the building? Imagine this was a character you'd never heard of or seen before. How confused would you be about your protagonist? It'd be like dropping into a TV series mid-season and never getting any context clues for why a character can shoot fire out of their eyes. Wouldn't you want to know? In essence, we have a superhero origin story where we learn nothing about these superheroes' actual origins, which are dubbed to be too uninteresting to even mention, much less explore and build a story out of. Instead, we are just told to import whatever we already know about him from other unrelated movies and call it good. How is that not the laziest act of narratorial resentment you've ever heard of? As a result, the movie has absolutely nothing to stand on. The two obvious sources of conflict, Peter's family history and learning the limits and consequences of his powers, are totally overlooked. Peter has a desire to become an Avenger, but without clear indications about what he has to learn to overcome to get there, or why he even wants it in the first place, his character can't make any choices to reach his desire apart from keep being Spider-Man. He has to just wait for the plot to come to him, which is stupid. Because we know nothing about Peter Parker, the other essential elements of story cannot develop. Any plot is more or less arbitrary since it can't be rooted in Peter's unfounded desires. There can be no conflict because there is nothing in Peter's characterization for him to become conflicted about because there's nothing in Peter's characterization. We know nothing about him, so there are no stakes beyond general physical danger, which is not a meaningful concern in this type of movie. Peter does have a goal, but there's nothing he can do to try and accomplish it beyond responding to the events that happen more or less coincidentally around him. As a result, all we have to care about is who he is going to kick punch, and that ends up being some old guy we don't know that much about either. We don't even get to wonder whether there's going to be an upside down kiss or something because, well...
Won't somebody please think of the children?
The reason for this narrative train wreck is simple and dumb. I think the storytellers just didn't want to tell another origin story, of which MCU had had at least half a dozen already, and which Spider-Man himself had had twice in the last 15 years.
Twice? 2 times.
I get not wanting to retread ground that's already broken, and origin stories all follow the same kind of formula. However, there are like 508 different iterations of Spider-Man, most notably Miles Morales. If you're tired of telling Peter Parker's story, tell Miles' story. Heaven knows MCU isn't hurting for white people. Someday. Or if you're not ready to make a non-white or a girl the hero of an MCU movie, make up a new story for Peter, one which plays against the audience expectations for that character you're so clearly aware of since you're exploiting them here. It doesn't even have to be an origin story. What if Peter's powers start changing and he's not sure how to handle it? Or his school discovers he's Spider-Man and it causes drama, or he actually does go to Avengers camp but misses being in high school. Anything. You're storytellers, for crying out loud. Don't you want to tell a story?
Work was hard, so we quit.
But of course, that's not what MCU is about. The Beige Overlord isn't in business to produce anything original or new. He is in business to put the least amount of effort possible into regurgitating things you're nostalgic about in order to grift you out of ticket and merchandise money. By this point in time, he'd spent a decade training audiences to not care about the broken stories these movies are telling, and only to look for the bright shinies and jokes. Spider-Man Homecoming is the apotheosis of and inevitable conclusion to 10 years of increasingly intentionally lazy storytelling where not even the most popular characters deserve even rudimentary characterization, and audiences and fans don't deserve basic respect from the producers of the content they love. Which, fine, but... One can overlook or excuse a broken story easily enough if at least the individual elements are fun. You know, if the jokes are really great or the characters are really cool. But that's not what we have here. Far be it from me to pick on a fictional teenager, but I gotta come clean. Peter Parker is far and away the worst part of this movie, which is a problem for a couple of different reasons. One is that annoying characters generally suck to spend time around and are harder to build empathy for.
Gavin, don't you already have this game?
No, Mom, you idiot!
Not necessarily a deal breaker in itself, especially when there is a compelling, real story to invest in. But the other reason is that since there isn't a compelling, real story, since Peter isn't given any backstory, stakes, or conflict, since Marvel doesn't like you, he has no way to grow out of being a dillhole, which means he's this way forever. Observe how Peter, our hero and protagonist, is the worst. He has a massive savior complex due to what he sees as his chosen one status. This is definitely exacerbated by Tony kidnapping him to Germany for a kick-punching fight, but I think he was already this way. Obviously this one isn't entirely his fault, but he continues to assume, without reason and eventually contrary to what Tony himself says, that he is basically an Avenger. Remember, he invents the whole Tony is seeing if I'll prove worthy thing out of whole cloth spun from his ego. He views it not as a cool potential opportunity, but as something that is his due now. He deserves to be an Avenger, and to be denied it is an injustice.
No, Mom, you idiot!
Peter treats all people disposably, including May, Ned, Happy, people on his academic Olympics team, his girlfriend, strangers he detains for crimes he doesn't have proof they were involved with, and strangers he tries to help. They are all means to his end of being a savior Avenger. Their problems don't matter because he has bigger fish to fry. Of course, some of you will say, yeah, he's a teenager. Teenagers are dicks. To which I reply, yes, but the movie is acting like all of this is just funny and not a problem he needs to overcome in order to develop into a true hero, meaning it is an oversight of writing, not intentional characterization.
I have Bloodstorm and Bone Squad and Bloodstorm 2, stupid.
He is kind of obsessed with himself, habitually watching videos of his escapades, posing for photos, and being dismissive of his friends and May.
Oh, I'm sorry, honey. We'll take a Bone Storm.
Well, get two. I'm not sharing with Caitlin.
And he's just not actually that good at superheroing, a thing the movie plays like a joke, but which should really be addressed. Remember when he physically assaults a person trying to get into their own car, then is like, oops, lol, guess I'll just get out of here? Or the time he leaves Donald Glover stuck to his car with spider goop for hours because he didn't buy alien weapons and provided valuable information? Or the time he contributed to the destruction of a local business with his inept attempt to stop an ATM robbery? Or the time he broke a ferry in half? Or all the other laws he breaks while pursuing bad guys, including trespassing, destruction of property, reckless driving, and Grand Theft Auto? Most of which the movie plays off as jokes, and none of which contribute to Peter learning anything about superheroing. Which, fine, there's a world where this Spider-Man movie is about an arrogant, self-centered kid getting caught up in the thrill of being a pretend Avenger and accidentally causing a lot of damage and hurt. He can have a moment where he realizes what he's doing isn't all good, that the people he wants to protect in his neighborhood are actually living with the consequences of his escapades.
I got so swept up in the scapegoating in fun of Proposition 24, I never stopped to think it might affect someone I cared about.
He can even call out Tony for the example he sets, running around the world, leaving smoking craters wherever he deems an Avenger incursion is necessary. Then he can turn his focus to actually being a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man and have it be convincing. It would fit right into Marvel's only character arc, the self-centered white guy who turns into mildly less of a dick through kick punching. But since the movie treats Peter's misbehavior as simply fodder for jokes, the story sees no reason to encourage him to stop. He's just being a kid. It's endearing. Boys will be boys.
What's better than this? Guys being dudes.
This means the movie somehow makes our underdog orphan hero unsympathetic. It also makes Peter's change of heart at the end of the movie, when he decides to not be an Avenger for reasons, it feels kind of arbitrary. It's a step the movie knows a lot of real movies would take, so it does, but it has provided no backing for this decision, so it is therefore meaningless. And even then, when he makes a decision that is supposedly the more altruistic one, Peter still seeks for approval, asking if Tony's offer was a test and whether he passed it. He's so thoughtful, always concerned about what's in it for him and whether others are seeing him do the right thing. Maybe in later movies his entitled savior complex is toned down, and he doesn't use the excuse of not getting into his preferred college to break the universe. Oh, I forgot that's not the multiverse that we're living in right now. Don't worry, Peter is far from the only terrible person in this movie. There are awful grown-ups, too. First up is Tony, who is using his deep-seated daddy issues as an excuse for doing all kinds of terrible things to Peter under the guise of mentorship. These things include actual kidnapping. This first happens in Civil War when, as we've discussed, Tony took a minor over whom he had no legal guardianship overseas, kidnapping, to help him commit violent, destructive crimes during an international crisis. We get to see more of it in flashback in this movie, and as literally the only piece of character exposition, it informs Peter's insufferable attitude. Tony does kidnapping again when he just takes Peter hundreds of miles away to Avengers School without notifying his guardian, and indicates he will live there full time. Weird thing to do with a 15-year-old in the middle of the school year, wouldn't you say? Monitoring and recording a minor. Speaking of weird things to do with a 15-year-old, the suit given to Peter by Tony records video and sound of Peter's movements and actions, at least whenever it is in use. Peter does not know about this for several months. The purpose of the recordings is unclear, and that the suit is apparently pretty easy to hack makes the recordings super irresponsible, in addition to super creepy and, super illegal. Providing deadly weapons to a minor. In addition to its creepy surveillance equipment, the suit is also packed with lots of features which it is pretty clear could cause a lot of harm, both to Peter and those around him. That these features are not disclosed to Peter, and that he is able to very easily hack into them again speaks to Tony's deep irresponsibleness. But it's okay, the movie mostly plays things like instant kill mode as a joke, since the suit's operating system is very obviously fine with stuff like a high schooler murdering people he thinks are doing wrong things, which is, funny. ignoring a mentee who clearly is looking for some help. This is more of a secondary thing compared to all the law breaking and endangerment, and it kind of falls on Happy as well, but Tony, with all of his emotional withholding and ignoring and stuff, is a terrible mentor. Also, I would think that Tony would know that by associating with Peter, he'd be raising the boy's profile, potentially exposing him to people who might want to exploit him and his abilities, and that therefore he'd need to be much more accessible? Even without the threat of potential danger, just being mildly around as the mentor he pledged to be seems like a minimum. Maybe not like chatting every day, but, not outsourcing his mentoring to his bodyguard who also has no business or interest in mentoring a kid. Instead, he's just being the same kind of absent dad he resented having himself. A story idea that might yield some thematic fruit if the movie was aware of it at all. But it treats all this as a joke too, so oh well.
Hard work made us quit.
Tony isn't the only terrible adult. The other big one, of course, is Birdman. Obviously, he's like the villain, but that doesn't make his multiple threats and attempts to kill a high school freshman not feel kind of weird in context. I get if you think Spider-Man is an adult, but once you find out he's the boy who's dating your daughter and isn't old enough to drive, wouldn't you think, well, maybe I don't need to murder him since he's, a kid. Pretty sure I can just have him arrested for trespassing on my warehouses or use my alien technology to trap him for long enough for my massive one-time life-changing heist to be done. Then there won't be anything for him to do and I don't have to break my daughter's heart by killing her boyfriend. Besides, Birdman's response to Spider-Man's annoyances is way out of line with the stakes. He's already super wealthy, and while his heist would guarantee a lot more income, it's not like he's in a desperate position. He's just insane for no reason that we can see, which means the writing is, lazy.
I'm gonna kill that kid!
Which, fine, there's a world where this story is maybe about Peter getting let down by his heroes and idols, finding a hostile and irrational adult world, and learning to trust and value his friends or something. Oh, that's way too messy for a movie that won't even give its protagonist basic characterization. The movie doesn't see any of this as anything other than fodder for jokes or cheap menace to create artificial conflict in a movie without any. It's one more reason why this doesn't feel like a real movie. Just the semblance of one made by aliens who have never actually experienced one for themselves but have heard about them. Or actual smart, talented people who just work for Kevy. Ready for more stuff? 1. In the movie, we are told that the windows at the top of the Washington Monument are made of 4-inch thick ballistic glass, which Peter kicks his way through in order to save his friends, which feels improbable. Depending on its composition, ballistic glass has a stopping power of a lot, which means to kick through it, Peter has to generate a force of more than actual bullets, which he does with his feet.
We are dealing with science here.
Which means that in addition to clinging to walls and whatever else his spider powers actually allow him to do, Peter's spider powers give him kicks with the approximate velocity of high-caliber ammunition, which seems like a big enough deal to maybe merit an explanation, but whatever. 2. At the end of the movie, Peter ends up outside an airplane as it's taking off. Eventually we see it break through a cloud ceiling, which we can place at about 6,500 feet. The craft continues rising as action continues to take place outside of it, so to be conservative, let's say it tops out at an altitude of 10,000 feet. At that altitude, the standard air temperature is about 23 degrees Fahrenheit, but factoring in wind chill since the plane is, moving at hundreds of miles an hour, Peter would have a perceived temperature of between maybe -5 and -15 degrees. We're obviously not in the instant hypothermia territory we've been in with Captain America jumping around hover carriers, but that's still cold enough to maybe be a factor in agility and dexterity, unless of course Peter's spider powers make him cold-proof, but of course we don't know that since his powers are never, explained. 3. At one point, Peter is holding 2 halves of a Staten Island ferry together with his body. From what I can tell, it appears to be a Molinari-class ferry, which has a carrying capacity of about 2,800 gross tons, or approximately 6,270,000 pounds. Which means that, even if the ferry is only at half capacity, Peter is holding up well over 1 million pounds of weight with each half of him. This doesn't even take into account the additional force being exerted on him as the 2 halves of the bolt separate. Now, obviously there are a few problems with this situation. One is that Peter has somehow synthesized a substance using high school chemistry equipment not only strong enough to endure this kind of intense load, but adhesive enough to not lose its grip.
Unlikely.
I doubt very highly that one elixir could boast so many fantastic properties.
The other is that even if Peter were made of actual literal steel, he'd still be torn apart. So we have to assume that the magic spider made him not only super strong, but somehow stronger than pretty much any substance other than his webs on Earth, which is a huge deal. And the movie doesn't think enough of us to actually tell us about it or offer an explanation as to why. Also, it makes Peter basically invincible, which is bad for tension. 4. PE coach Hannibal Buress helpfully points out that Steve Rogers is more or less a war criminal, which is good, because he pretty much is. But of course the movie treats it as a haha, that's a funny line moment that acts as a soft pardon for anything Steve might have been held accountable for, at least narratively. The definitely not a lazy Ferris Bueller reference post-credits scene compounds the pardon into actual policy, which is gross. 5. How do Peter's non-Tony provided spider goggles work? Like, they dilate and stuff in what seems to be a pretty automatic or at least hands-off way. Did Peter design and make them? Also, we know from Civil War that they help him tune things out, but he only wears them when he's crime fighting. Is that the only time his senses do things? Like, it's nice that they leave him alone during school. This is why we need to know about his powers, otherwise we don't know what he can and can't do and nothing matters or makes sense. 6. The Department of Damage Control is a little silly. See, damage control generally refers to the action of mitigating harm or trouble which is actively taking place, generally in a public relations kind of way. Like, a candidate for office will engage in damage control when they say or do something dumb. I just find this a ridiculous name for a clandestine government agency tasked with cleaning things up who we're supposed to take seriously and view as maybe an antagonist. Like, does the movie view the Ataris as a PR problem? The government already has a disaster response arm. Is FEMA not good enough for aliens? Or, already corrupt? 7. Peter has lost multiple backpacks while out spidering, which seems silly since he can hide one anywhere, like on a rooftop, but instead his strategy is to use his spider goop, which he says dissolves after a couple of hours, to keep it at ground level in a filthy alley. Whatever, teenagers are dumb, I guess. 8. No one who sees, meets, or knows about May doesn't hit on her or comment on her hotness whenever they see or think about her. Her entire character is basically hot and it's never not weird since her dating life has no purpose in the story that I can tell, beyond, I guess, making Peter squirm. Marvel loves women and definitely thinks they're people. 9. So, as far as anyone in the movie knows, Spider-Man is a local New York City phenomenon. Like that Speedo-wearing cowboy who plays guitar in Times Square. So isn't it kind of weird that no one thinks it's weird that he shows up in Washington, D.C. to help students from a high school in his part of New York? Like, did he follow them or just happen to be on vacation there at the same time? For as concerned about being found out as Peter is, it seems like this could be, a thing to help build the story around. I mean, if we were trying to make a story based on things the characters might experience conflict about or whatever.
Work was hard, so we quit.
10. Who has Birdman been selling his alien weapons to all these years? I mean, he's clearly rich, so he's been selling something to somebody, but no one apparently knows about the weapons, nor have they evidently been used in crimes except for the robbery Peter doesn't stop. So he just picked out the most discreet people to sell to? Or was the movie too lazy to make it work? Wouldn't it be better if part of why Birdman was so driven is that he's on the verge of losing his house or something because it's taken so long to make a viable product with the alien tech, instead of him already being successful? Then his blue-collar chip on his shoulder makes sense? Or not, whatever. I think that's all. At the end of the day, Spider-Man Homecoming is pretty much fully and completely broken by its lazy writing. It is incapable of providing anything meaningful or even really entertaining in terms of theme or story, nor can it diagnose or do anything to correct its own dumbness. There are no stakes, so there is no reason for Peter to improve or even recognize his flaws, and since he's not a character, he can't experience any sort of resolvable conflict or be part of a coherent, relevant plot. He therefore has nothing to work for or gain, and the story itself has nothing to say. And in addition to the broken story, the entire movie just feels a little off because it doesn't know how to deal with its child protagonist. In a cartoon, we can see a 15-year-old Peter getting into all these perilous grown-up circumstances and a grown-up acting so villainously toward him. But in live action, the threshold for suspending disbelief is higher, and the things that make a cartoon fun or menacing often feel silly in live action. Like, Rescuers is plenty of fun even though it's kind of dark, but a live-action Rescuers would only be traumatizing and silly, like Split with helpful anthropomorphic mice. Questions like, why in the world does Peter not notify authorities about the weapons of mass destruction he's discovered, become harder not to ask, and the fragile reality the movie needs is shattered. Rather than a story with high school stakes and high school adversaries as Peter learns to control his powers, we have a movie with real-world life and death stakes that our protagonist is only coincidentally involved with in the first place, and really not mentally or emotionally equipped to handle anyway. But whatever, we're not watching this to find something coherent. We're watching this because we've been conditioned by the largest entertainment company on the planet that Spider-Man is an essential, beloved character we can't possibly live without. And so we won't, for the rest of our natural lives, so long as the Earth shall last and we have money to spend on tickets or subscriptions. Anyway, that'll do it for this episode. Be sure and join me next time when we'll be looking at Thor Ragnarok, the movie Marvel used to distract us with funnies so we wouldn't notice them jumping the shark. Good night.
That must be the happiest kid in the world.